The bones were found in a place where bones should not have survived. The Sahara, the largest hot desert on Earth. 8 million square kilometers of rock and sand, and heat so absolute that it strips everything that dies there down to its most basic components in a matter of years. The sun bleaches, the wind scours, the dryness desiccates. There is no moisture to preserve organic material, no shade to slow the work of exposure, no mercy in the chemistry of a place where water has been essentially absent for thousands of years. And yet, in specific locations across the Sahara, human remains have survived. Not everywhere, not most places, but in particular caves, in particular rock shelters, in the specific microenvironments created by overhanging sandstone cliffs that blocked the worst of the sun and wind, bones have endured. Not for centuries, for millennia, 10,000 years, 12,000, in some cases longer. The remains themselves were remarkable enough. People who had lived in the Sahara at a time when the Sahara was not the Sahara as we know it, when it was green, when it had lakes and rivers and forests and grasslands and rainfall, when it supported populations of humans and animals that would be entirely at home in the landscapes of sub-Saharan Africa today. This period is called the African Humid Period, or the Green Sahara, and it lasted from roughly 11,000 to 5,000 years ago. The people who lived in the Green Sahara left evidence everywhere. Rock art on the walls of shelters across the entire region, painted and engraved images of cattle and hippos and crocodiles, of human figures dancing and swimming and herding and hunting, of a world so different from the current one that the images feel like dispatches from another planet. Fishing hooks of bone found hundreds of miles from any current water source, the middens of freshwater shellfish in the absolute desert, the bones of cattle in places where no cattle could survive today, and the human bones, the remains of the people who lived there. When researchers began to extract and sequence ancient DNA from those bones, they expected to find something. What they found was something they had not expected at all. Something that changed the way the ancient history of human population, movements across Africa and the world is understood. The DNA should not have been there. Not in the sense that the DNA was impossible or supernatural. It was entirely real. But the genetic signatures encoded in those ancient bones pointed to population origins and connections that the geography, the archaeology, and the prior assumptions of researchers had simply not predicted. People in the middle of the Sahara, 10,000 years ago, carrying genetic ancestry that connected them not to the populations immediately around them, but to populations far distant. Populations from the Near East. Populations from sub-Saharan Africa. Populations whose presence in the heart of the Sahara during the Green Period required a rethinking of the entire picture of how ancient humans moved across the African continent and between Africa and the rest of the world. This is their story. And it begins, as all human stories eventually do, with the movement of water. The Sahara's relationship with water is the key to everything. The desert as it currently exists, the largest hot desert on Earth, a place of almost unimaginable aridity, is not a permanent condition. It is a phase, one that recurs on a predictable cycle driven by the slow wobble of the Earth's axial tilt and the shifting of its orbital position relative to the sun, a cycle that takes approximately 21,000 years to complete. At certain points in this cycle, the northern hemisphere receives more solar radiation during summer than at other points. More summer radiation means more heat over the Eurasian landmass. More heat means stronger low-pressure systems over the interior of the continent. Stronger low-pressure systems mean stronger monsoon winds pulling moisture from the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean into the interior of Africa. More moisture means rain. Rain means rivers. Rivers mean lakes. Lakes mean life. During the African Humid Period, which reached its peak around 9,000 years ago, the Sahara received enough rainfall to support a completely different ecosystem. The lakes were real and large. Lake Mega Chad, the ancestral body of water that occupied the basin where tiny Lake Chad now sits, was at times larger than the Caspian Sea, one of the largest lakes in the world. The Nile's tributaries ran deeper and further than they do today. Rivers flowed across the central Sahara that now exist only as dry valleys, wadis, visible from the air, as pale traces in the rock. The ghost rivers of the Green Sahara, their courses still legible in the landscape 10,000 years after the last drop of water moved through them. Sit with that for a moment. Rivers that ran for thousands of years are now completely dry. Their beds are still there, carved into the bedrock by the force of water moving across it, but empty. The water is gone and has been gone for 5,000 years. And where it ran, there is now sand and rock, and the kind of silence that a desert has at night when the wind drops and there is nothing living within 100 miles to make a sound. But once there was water, and where there was water, there was life. The grasses grew first, moving northward from the Sahel as the rains came. Then the trees, acacias and wild olives in the upland areas, fig trees and tamarisk along the watercourses. Then the animals, elephant, giraffe, lion, leopard, hyena, buffalo. Species that we now associate exclusively with sub-Saharan savanna grasslands were living in the Central Sahara 10,000 years ago, because the Central Sahara 10,000 years ago was savanna grassland. The bones of these animals have been found across the entire region, in sediments deposited when the lakes were full and the rivers were flowing. And then the hippopotamus. The presence of hippopotamus bones in the Sahara is perhaps the most viscerally startling piece of evidence for the Green Sahara, because the hippopotamus is an animal so specifically and completely dependent on large bodies of permanent water that its presence is an infallible indicator that large bodies of permanent water were there. You cannot have a hippo without a river or a lake. The hippo bones in the Central Sahara are the bones of animals that lived in real, persistent, substantial water bodies. Lakes deep enough and permanent enough for hippos to wallow and feed and reproduce across multiple generations. The crocodile, too. There are crocodile remains in the Sahara, crocodile bones in regions that have not seen rain in a decade. The gap between what those bones imply and what the landscape currently offers is so vast that it requires a deliberate act of imagination to bridge it. Standing in the Tinere Desert today, surrounded by rock and sand and the complete absence of moisture in the air, trying to imagine a crocodile in the water at your feet. But it was there. The bones say so. People moved into this green world from every direction. From the south, populations from the Sahel and sub-Saharan Africa followed the retreating desert northward as the rains came and the grasslands advanced. These were mobile populations, practiced in the art of following seasonal water and seasonal grazing across large territories. The greening Sahara was not unknown terrain to them. It was the northward extension of the landscape they already inhabited, opening up ahead of them as the climate shifted, inviting them in. From the east, populations from the Nile Valley and the Horn of Africa followed the new rivers westward into territory that had been impassable desert a few thousand years before. The Nile corridor has always been one of the great highways of human movement, the river providing water and food and a navigable route through otherwise inhospitable terrain. When the rivers of the Central Sahara began to flow, they provided new routes westward from the Nile, new landscapes accessible from what had been a dead end, new territories that the Nile Valley populations could expand into. And from the north and northeast, populations from the Maghreb and possibly from the Levant moved southward. The North African coastline has been inhabited by modern humans for at least 100,000 years. The populations of the Maghreb during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene were descended from much earlier colonizers of the region, people who had lived through the glacial maximum in the relatively favorable conditions of the North African coast, and who now, as the climate improved and the Sahara greened, had the possibility of moving southward into a region that had been closed to them for tens of thousands of years. The result was a mixing event on a scale that the African continent had not seen since the populations that now separated regions had first diverged. A convergence of peoples who had been developing separately, in different landscapes, adapting to different conditions, accumulating different genetic variants and different cultural practices, now suddenly in contact in the same green world, sharing the same water, competing for, and cooperating over the same resources. The genetics of that convergence are what the bones preserved. The DNA that the scientists found in those bones that should not have been there according to the old, simpler picture, was the molecular record of that meeting. Let us begin with the specific discoveries that gave this story its shape. The Gobero site, discovered by paleontologist Paul Sereno and his team in Niger in 2000, is one of the most extraordinary archaeological finds of the 21st century. Sereno was in the Tenere Desert, one of the most remote and hostile regions of the entire Sahara, a vast sea of sand dunes in the east of Niger, where the nearest permanent water source was hundreds of kilometers away, and the temperature regularly exceeded 50 degrees Celsius, looking for dinosaur fossils when his team stumbled upon something entirely unexpected. Human bones, hundreds of them, emerging from the sand in a region where no human being should have been living, in a landscape of absolute desert with no visible source of water for hundreds of kilometers in any direction. They were coming out of the ground because the wind had stripped away the sand that had covered them for thousands of years. This is one of the most important facts about the archaeology of the Sahara. The desert reveals and conceals on its own timetable, independent of any human archaeological program. The wind removes sand from some areas and deposits it in others, and the removing exposes what has been buried, sometimes after centuries of concealment, sometimes after millennia. Sites that were covered and invisible a generation ago are now accessible. Sites that are accessible now may be buried again in a generation. The archaeology of the Sahara is a race between the archaeologist and the wind, conducted in a landscape where the wind has been at work far longer and has a significant head start. At Gobero, the wind had done the archaeologist's work for them. It had exposed the bones of an ancient cemetery, more than 200 individual burials, carefully arranged, some of them elaborately positioned, lying in the dust of what had once been a lakeshore. The site had been occupied at two distinct periods, separated by roughly 1,000 years, a gap during which the lake level had dropped, and the area was too dry for permanent habitation, followed by a return of water and a return of people. The older burials, dating to approximately 10,000 years ago, belonged to a population of hunter-fishers, people who were living beside the lake, fishing its waters with bone hooks, hunting the animals that gathered at its edges, gathering the plants that grew along its shores. They were tall, significantly taller than the average for the period, suggesting a diet rich in the animal protein from the abundant fish and game of the lakeside environment. Their tools were elegant, their burial practices careful, suggesting a community with sufficient social complexity to maintain ceremonies around death. Among the older burials was the woman and the two children, buried together, her arms arranged around them, the bones of her embrace still intact. The children were positioned against her, their small skeletons nested in the curve of her body. The arrangement was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate positioning before the earth covered them. Someone had placed them this way. Someone had cared about how they lay. The younger burials, from around 5,000 years ago, belonged to a different population, Yemé pastoralists, cattle herders who had moved into the region as the lake was beginning to contract, following the water and the grass with their herds, camping on the shoreline while it was still accessible. These people were physically different from the earlier hunter-fishers, shorter, with different skeletal proportions, suggesting different population origins. They buried their dead differently too, with less elaborate positioning, but with grave goods, pottery, animal bones, objects that may have had personal significance. Two populations in the same place, separated by 1,000 years, the lake connecting them, the lake bringing both of them there, the lake eventually failing both of them as the rains diminished and the water retreated and the desert advanced from every direction. When the water was finally gone, they left. The burials stayed. For 5,000 years, the sand covered them. The desert did its work. The bones dried and hardened in the dry air and were preserved by the very conditions that killed the world around them. And then the wind changed and the sand moved, and the bones emerged into the light of a Tenere afternoon and were photographed by a paleontologist who had come looking for dinosaurs and found something far more recent and far more human. If you are finding peace in this tonight, go ahead and subscribe to Ancient Sleep Stories. More slow history is waiting for you whenever you need it. The ancient genomes from the Green Sahara contained ancestry components that should not have been there, given what researchers had previously assumed about the genetic history of African populations. Specifically, they contained evidence of genetic ancestry from populations associated with the Levant, the eastern Mediterranean region encompassing what is now Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. The Levantine ancestry in the Sahara bones pointed to something that the conventional picture of ancient African population history had not fully accounted for. A movement of people from the Near East into Africa that predated by thousands of years the movements that researchers had previously identified and studied. An ancient back migration from the region that modern humans had expanded into after leaving Africa. A reversal of the Great Dispersal, people returning from the Near East into Africa and moving deep into the continent's interior during the African humid period. This is not as strange as it might initially seem. The period of the Green Sahara coincided with a period of significant population movement across the entire region, connecting Africa, the Near East, and Europe. The end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, had opened up landscapes and migration corridors that had been closed during the glacial maximum. Populations that had been confined to refugia, specific areas where conditions were survivable during the most extreme cold, expanded outward as the ice retreated and the climate improved. These expansions crossed paths. They interacted. They mixed. The particular ancestry signature in the Sahara bones appears to derive from populations that had been part of the early Neolithic expansion in the Near East. The communities that were among the first in the world to develop agriculture, cultivating wheat and barley and keeping domesticated animals in the fertile river valleys of what is now Iraq and Syria and Turkey. These populations expanded westward into Europe and southward into Africa, and the Green Sahara, with its abundance of water and grassland, would have been an extraordinarily attractive destination for people who knew how to manage domesticated animals. The cattle herders of the Green Sahara, the pastoralists whose burials at Gobero and elsewhere are the most recent layer of human presence in the region, were, in part, genetically descended from these Near Eastern populations, blended with the earlier hunter-fisher populations who had been in the region since the first greening of the desert. The cattle themselves, evidence suggests, were domesticated initially in the Near East, and the knowledge and the animals and the people who kept them moved into Africa together. But there was another component in the Sahara bones that was equally unexpected, and whose implications ran in a different direction entirely. Some of the ancient genomes from the Green Sahara contained ancestry associated with populations from sub-Saharan Africa, specifically with genetic signatures that are most closely related to present-day populations in West and Central Africa. This was not by itself surprising. The Green Sahara would obviously have drawn populations northward from the sub-Saharan regions to its south. The grasslands and the lakes would have been accessible from the Sahel, and populations that had been living in those southern regions would have followed the expanding grasslands northward into the newly habitable zone. What was surprising was the distribution and the timing. The sub-Saharan ancestry signatures in some of the Sahara bones were not the result of recent mixing between local populations. They were deep, old, pointing to connections between populations that predated the African humid period itself, to ancient links between the populations of the Sahara and those of sub-Saharan Africa that stretch back into a period before the desert had formed at all, to a time when the populations that would later be separated by the desert barrier were still in contact, still connected, still sharing genetic material through the normal processes of human movement and intermarriage across a landscape that was not yet a barrier. And then the desert formed, and the connections were severed, and the populations on either side of the new barrier evolved separately for tens of thousands of years. And then the Green Sahara arrived, and the barrier dissolved, and the populations came back into contact and found, in each other's DNA, the echo of the connection they had shared before the desert intervened. The genetics of the ancient Sahara are, among other things, a record of reunion. But the reunion was not the only thing the DNA recorded. There was a third ancestry component in some of the Green Sahara bones that was equally unexpected, and that pointed in a different direction from either the sub-Saharan or the Levantine signatures. Some individuals from specific sites in the Central Sahara showed genetic ancestry most closely related to populations from the Horn of Africa, from the region of what is now Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia. This was itself not entirely surprising given the geography. The Horn of Africa is not far from the Sahara in geological terms, and populations from that region would have had access to the Green Sahara via the Nile corridor. But the specific character of the ancestry signature suggested that this was not simply a local population movement from the adjacent region. It was a connection to a distinct population that had been developing separately in the Horn of Africa for a significant period before the Green Sahara opened. The Horn of Africa ancestry that appears in some Saharan ancient genomes is related to what geneticists call the basal Eurasian component, a deeply ancient ancestry signature that appears to derive from a population that separated from the other ancestors of modern humans very early in the history of modern human dispersal, and that retained its distinctive genetic character through a long period of relative isolation before mixing with other populations. The presence of this ancestry in the Green Sahara genomes adds another layer to the already complex picture of who the people of the African humid period actually were. They were not any single thing. They were the convergence of many things. Hunter-fishers from the sub-Saharan south, pastoralists with Near Eastern ancestry moving southward from the Maghreb and the Levant, populations from the Horn of Africa moving westward along ancient pathways into the new landscape of the Green Sahara, all of them converging on the same lakes, the same rivers, the same grasslands, in the same 10,000-year window before the desert returned. The mixing was not uniform. Different sites showed different combinations of ancestry, reflecting the different histories of the specific locations. Which populations were closest, which corridors of movement opened first, which groups arrived earliest and which arrived later and mixed with an already mixed population. The genetics of the Green Sahara is not a single story, but many overlapping stories, each one playing out in a specific location at a specific time, the whole ensemble producing a picture of extraordinary human diversity in a landscape that is now one of the most uninhabitable on Earth. This diversity, this record of convergence and mixing, was not lost when the desert returned. It was carried out of the Sahara by the people who left, distributed into the populations of sub-Saharan Africa and the Nile Valley and the Maghreb and the Horn of Africa and the Near East, diluted and mixed and transformed by subsequent generations of movement and mixing, but never entirely erased. The genetic legacy of the Green Sahara persists in modern African populations in ways that researchers are still working to fully characterize, as the database of ancient African genomes grows and the analytical methods for interpreting them improve. Every generation of research adds new resolution to the picture. New sites are excavated. New bones yield usable DNA. New computational methods extract more information from degraded genetic material. The picture that was startling and unexpected 5 years ago becomes the baseline for the next set of questions, each answer generating new questions that require new data to address. This is how science works in real time. Not as a sequence of decisive revelations, but as a gradual accumulation of resolution. The picture becoming less blurry with each new piece of evidence, never entirely sharp, always with regions of uncertainty at its edges, but progressively more detailed and more reliable as the work continues. The work on the Green Sahara is ongoing. The sites are being excavated, the samples are being analyzed, the papers are being written and published and argued over and built upon. The people of the Green Sahara are becoming, slowly and incompletely, but genuinely, known. The story of modern human origins and dispersal is far more complex than the simple picture that was available before ancient DNA analysis became possible. The old picture was essentially this: modern humans evolved in Africa around 300,000 years ago, expanded out of Africa in one or perhaps two major dispersal events beginning around 60 to 70,000 years ago, and spread across the rest of the world, replacing the archaic human populations they encountered. This picture is not entirely wrong, but it is vastly incomplete. Ancient DNA has revealed that the actual history involved multiple dispersal events, multiple periods of isolation and reconnection, multiple mixing events between populations that had been separated for tens of thousands of years, and a degree of complexity and contingency that makes the simple Ode of Africa narrative feel like a rough sketch rather than a detailed map. The people who left Africa were not all the same population. The people who spread across Eurasia mixed with Neanderthals and Denisovans in ways that left permanent genetic marks on modern populations. The populations that expanded back into Africa from the Near East during the early Holocene, the period that includes the Green Sahara, brought with them genetic ancestry that had been shaped by tens of thousands of years of Eurasian adaptation and mixing. And within Africa itself, the picture is equally complex. The continent is not genetically uniform. It is the most genetically diverse region on Earth, because it has been continuously inhabited by modern humans for longer than any other region, and the internal diversity that accumulates over time has had more time to develop there than anywhere else. Africa contains genetic lineages that diverged from each other hundreds of thousands of years ago. The San people of southern Africa carry genetic ancestry that branched from other human lineages before many of the populations that would later expand across the world had even differentiated from each other. The ancient Sahara sits at the intersection of all of these complexity layers. It was, during the Green Period, a crossroads, a place where populations from different parts of Africa and from the Near East converged on the same abundant landscape, lived in proximity, interacted, and left in their descendants' DNA a record of the convergence. The bones in the rock shelters of Niger and Chad and Libya and Algeria are the physical remains of that convergence, and the DNA within those bones is the molecular memory of it. The rock art of the Green Sahara is the visual record. Across the central and western Sahara, on the walls of rock shelters and on the surfaces of boulders in the middle of otherwise featureless desert, there are tens of thousands of images. The density is astonishing. Some areas of the Saharan massifs, particularly the Tassili Niger Plateau in what is now Algeria, contain one of the largest concentrations of prehistoric rock art anywhere in the world. Thousands of images in a single area, painted and engraved over a period of thousands of years, layered on top of each other in some places where successive generations returned to the same wall and added their own images to what their predecessors had made. The images document, with extraordinary directness, the world that existed during the Green Sahara. Hippopotamuses and crocodiles in a region where the nearest water is now hundreds of kilometers away. Cattle in their hundreds, depicted with a care and a specificity that suggests their herders knew individual animals, the particular shape of a specific horn, the pattern of a specific hide. Fish, shown in the same images as cattle, because the same people who herded cattle also fished the lakes. Human figures in scenes of extraordinary variety. Hunters with bows, dancers in ceremonial dress. Women with elaborate hairstyles. People swimming. People gathered around what appear to be fires. People engaged in the ordinary business of life in a world that no longer exists. The style of the images changes over time. The earliest images, the oldest layer, dating to before the most intense period of the Green Sahara, around 12 to 14,000 years ago, show predominantly wild animals, painted with a naturalistic precision that recalls the cave paintings of Europe from the same general period. As the Sahara greened and human populations expanded into it, the images shift toward pastoral scenes. Cattle becomes central. The human figure becomes more prominent. The art becomes more narrative, showing not just animals but humans in relationship with animals, herding, hunting, living alongside them. And then, as the Sahara dries, as the rains diminish and the lakes shrink and the grasslands retreat southward, the images change again. The cattle thin, the water animals disappear. The human figures acquire an urgency they did not have before, as if the artists knew that what they were recording was ending. The last images from the drying period include images of horses and camels, animals suited to arid conditions that replace the cattle of the wetter period. And then, eventually, the art stops. The people left. The desert returned. The rock art of the Green Sahara is one of the most moving documents in human history precisely because of what it records, without knowing it is recording it. The people who painted those images were not documenting a civilization they knew was ending. They were painting their world because it was their world. The hippo was there. The cattle were there. The lake was there. They painted what they saw. And then the rain stopped, and everything they painted into the rock was all that remained. The drying of the Sahara was not a sudden event. It was a process that unfolded over thousands of years, beginning around 7,000 years ago and accelerating around 5,000 years ago, as the shifts in the Earth's orbital and axial parameters that had driven the monsoon system northward began to reverse. The monsoons retreated southward. The lakes shrank. The rivers thinned and then went dry. The grasslands retreated, following the rain. The pace of this drying was not uniform. Some lakes held on longer than others. Some river systems persisted in attenuated form for centuries after the surrounding landscape had already begun to show the advance of the desert. There was a period, probably several centuries long, when the Sahara was neither fully green nor fully desert, but something in between, pockets of water in a landscape that was becoming increasingly hostile between those pockets. Islands of habitability in an advancing sea of aridity. For the people who were still there during this transition period, the experience must have been a slow-motion emergency, not the sudden catastrophe of an earthquake or a flood, something that happens in a moment and demands an immediate response, but the gradual, relentless, decade-by-decade advance of conditions that made staying increasingly difficult and eventually impossible. The lake that had been a kilometer across was now a quarter of that. The river that had run year-round now ran only in the wet season, and even then more feebly than before. The grass that had grown along the lakeshore was retreating as the shoreline retreated. When do you leave? How much diminishment is enough? How long do you stay in a place that is slowly becoming unlivable before you accept that it is no longer livable and go? These are questions that have no universal answer. Different communities, different families, different individuals would have made different decisions at different times. Some left early, when the first signs of the drying were becoming clear, when the smart reading of the landscape's direction suggested that staying was going to become progressively harder. Some stayed longer, until the last water was gone, trying to make it work with diminishing resources, perhaps not understanding or not accepting what the trend lines were telling them. The archaeological record shows both patterns, sites that were abandoned gradually, with clear evidence of a planned departure, the valuables taken, the structures left in good condition, the food stores depleted in an orderly way that suggests the occupants knew they were going and had time to prepare, and sites that show a more abrupt end, artifacts left in place, structures not maintained, evidence of a departure that was less organized, perhaps more desperate. People followed the water. The movement of populations out of the drying Sahara is one of the most significant population events in human history, and its consequences are still visible in the distribution of genetic ancestry across Africa and the Near East today. Populations that had converged on the Green Sahara from multiple directions now dispersed from it as it died, carrying with them the mixed genetic heritage of the convergence period into new territories. Some moved south, into the Sahel, and then into sub-Saharan Africa, pushing into territories that were already occupied and either displacing the existing populations or mixing with them. The genetic evidence from modern African populations contains signatures of both processes. The southward movement of pastoralists out of the dying Sahara is one of the key events in the population history of sub-Saharan Africa, contributing to the spread of both cattle herding and specific genetic ancestry profiles across a broad swathe of eastern and southern Africa over the millennia following the end of the African humid period. The spread of cattle herding southward through Africa is one of the most important cultural economic transitions in the continent's history. Before the Saharan pastoralists moved south, cattle herding was largely confined to the northern regions. The pastoralists who left the dying Sahara brought their animals and their knowledge of how to manage them southward into new territories, and the practice spread from there, carried by subsequent generations of movement and adoption until it reached the southernmost regions of the continent. The cattle herding cultures of East and Southern Africa today, the Maasai, the Zulu, the Herero, and the Himba, and dozens of other societies whose identity and economy are organized around their cattle, are, in a long-chain historical sense, the descendants of this movement. Some moved east, into the Nile Valley, which was still flowing, still fertile, still capable of supporting the populations that were now converging on it from the desiccating west. The Nile Valley at the end of the African humid period received an influx of population from the dying Sahara that is visible in the ancient DNA of early Egyptian populations. The people who would eventually build the Old Kingdom civilization, who would build the pyramids, who would develop one of the most sophisticated administrative states in the ancient world, were, in part, the descendants of the pastoralists who had herded their cattle across the Green Sahara and then followed the water east as the desert returned. This is a connection that the ancient Egyptians themselves could not have known. They would not have traced their ancestry to the people of the lakes and the rock shelters of the Central Sahara. The distance in time and geography was too great, but the bones and the DNA connect them. The ancient cattle herders of the Green Sahara and the pyramid builders of the Nile Valley are part of the same long movement of people across a landscape that was itself moving, greening and drying and greening again on cycles too long for any individual human life to perceive. The Nile Valley in the period immediately following the end of the African humid period, sometimes called the pre-dynastic period in Egyptian archaeology, shows evidence of a dramatic increase in population density. Sites that had been small and scattered become larger and more numerous. The social complexity that would eventually produce the pharaonic state was beginning to develop. Differences in burial wealth suggesting the emergence of social hierarchies, the first signs of administrative organization, the development of the artistic and symbolic conventions that would mature into the visual language of ancient Egyptian civilization. Some of this complexity was driven by the population influx from the West. People arriving from the dying Sahara brought with them knowledge and skills, cattle herding, the management of domesticated animals, the specific agricultural and pastoral knowledge that the longer contact with Near Eastern populations during the African humid period had introduced into the Saharan population. The Nile Valley received not just people, but the cultural and economic knowledge that those people carried. Some moved north, into the Maghreb, and from there into the Mediterranean world. The genetic legacy of the Green Sahara's populations is detectable in present-day North African populations, layered over the earlier ancestry of the populations that had been in the Maghreb before the African humid period, and the later ancestry introduced by the Arab expansion of the 7th and 8th centuries CE. The genome of a living North African person today contains traces of all of these movements, stacked on top of each other like the layers of rock in a sedimentary cliff, each one deposited in sequence, each one preserving the evidence of the specific time and conditions of its formation. And some, presumably, went nowhere, stayed in the territories closest to the last water, adapted to increasing aridity for as long as adaptation was possible. And then, when adaptation was no longer sufficient, disappeared from the archaeological record entirely. Not necessarily dead, but dispersed beyond the ability of archaeology to track them, their descendants absorbed into the populations of the regions they eventually reached. The bones in the Saharan rock shelters are, in part, the remains of people who did not make it out, who were buried where they died, in the shelters that provided the conditions for their preservation, and who lay there for thousands of years as the desert settled in around them. They were found by researchers who were not looking for them. That is how most of the great discoveries in archaeology happen. Someone is looking for something else. Sereno's team was looking for dinosaurs. The wind had uncovered the bones. The desert itself, in its slow and indifferent work of erosion, had brought them to the surface at the moment when there were people equipped to understand what they were. The ancient DNA technology that made their full significance readable did not exist when Sereno first photographed the bones at Gobero in 2000. It had to be developed over the following 2 decades by researchers working on different questions, building the techniques that would eventually be turned on these samples and produce the results that stopped the scientists in their tracks. This is also how science works. The question that the Sahara bones eventually answered was not the question that drove the development of the technology that answered it. The technology was built for other purposes and then turned on this problem, and the answer it produced was one that nobody had specifically been trying to find. Discovery by sideways approach, the universe yielding its secrets not to direct assault, but to the patient accumulation of capability that eventually makes the direct question answerable. The woman and the 2 children at Gobero, buried together in an embrace that has lasted 5,000 years. Whose DNA is now sequenced and analyzed and placed in the context of the broader picture of ancient human movement across the African continent. We do not know her name. We do not know the names of the children. We do not know whether they were her biological children or children she had adopted or taken in. The embrace is the embrace of someone who held them, but the specific nature of the relationship is not legible in the bones or the DNA. What we know is that someone buried them this way deliberately, that the posture was arranged, not accidental, that the people who placed them in the ground cared enough about how they were remembered, or about how they would rest, to take the time to arrange the arms and the bodies in this specific configuration before the earth closed over them, 5,000 years ago, in a place that was already beginning to dry, on the edge of a world that was ending. Someone loved them enough to make sure they did not lie alone. The genetics of those three individuals, when eventually analyzed, would contribute to the broader picture of who the people of the Green Sahara were, their population origins, their connections to the wider world of ancient human movement, their place in the story of how Africa was populated and depopulated and repopulated across the long cycles of the desert's breathing. But that is not the thing that stays with you when you think about the Gobero site. What stays with you is the arms, the way the bones of her arms are still arranged around the bones of the children she held, the geometry of care preserved in the chemistry of bone across 5,000 years of absolute desert. The fact that this arrangement, this specific act of love or grief or both, survived everything that the Sahara could do to it, and was still legible to a scientist kneeling in the sand in the year 2000, photographing it in the light of a Ténéré afternoon. Love is one of the things that the desert did not destroy. The full picture of the Green Sahara and its people is still being assembled. New sites are found every year, as climate change reduces the sand cover that conceals them, and as research programs become more systematic in their surveys of the Central and Western Sahara. New ancient DNA samples are analyzed and added to the growing database of ancient African genomes. New interpretations of the rock art are proposed as researchers bring new analytical tools to images that have been known for decades but not fully understood. The picture that is emerging is of a period in African history of extraordinary dynamism, not a static, bounded world of fixed populations and fixed territories, but a mobile, connected, mixing world in which people moved across vast distances, following water and grass and the specific knowledge of where food could be found. A world in which the boundaries between populations were porous and permeable, maintained by geography when geography was barrier-like, but dissolving when the geography opened up. The Green Sahara was an opening, a 10,000-year window in which the Great Desert became a corridor, and the populations on either side of it, African and Near Eastern, sub-Saharan and Mediterranean, converged on the same landscape and left in each other's DNA the mark of the meeting. And then the window closed, the desert returned. The populations dispersed, carrying the mixed ancestry of the convergence period into every corner of Africa and beyond. The bones of the people who did not leave remained in the shelters, covered by sand, waiting in the dark for the wind to uncover them and the science to arrive to read them. They were found. Their DNA should not have been there, according to what researchers had assumed, and that assumption, confronted with the evidence of the bones, had to give way. The story had to be rewritten. The map of ancient human movement had to be redrawn, with new arrows showing movements that had not previously been accounted for. New connections between populations that had been assumed to be separate, new complexity in a picture that had already been complex. This is what the bones in the Sahara revealed. Not just the specific genetic ancestry of the specific people who lived and died there during the African humid period, but a deeper truth about the nature of human history, that it is always more connected than the previous generation of researchers assumed, that the barriers that seem impassable, the deserts, the seas, the mountains, the distances, are always, over the long enough timescale, crossed. That human beings are movers, that the impulse to follow the water, to go where the grass is, to find the better place on the other side of the forbidding terrain, this impulse has driven human movement across the entire surface of the earth, and no desert has ever been permanent enough to stop it permanently. The Sahara stopped it for a while, for long enough that the populations on either side of it diverged genetically, developed separately, became distinct enough that when they eventually met again in the Green Sahara, the distinctness was visible and measurable in their bones. But it did not stop it forever. The rain came, the desert greened. The people came from every direction to the water. They lived beside the same lakes and herded their cattle in the same grasslands and buried their dead in the same shelters and painted the same animals on the same walls. And their children carried within them the evidence of the meeting in the patterns of their DNA, in the specific combination of ancestry that the bones eventually yielded to the scientists' instruments. All of this happened in a place that is now one of the harshest environments on Earth. The lakes are gone. The rivers are dry, the cattle are gone, the hippos and crocodiles are gone. The people are gone, dispersed into the populations of Africa and the Near East. Their specific identities dissolved into the larger flow of human history. What remains is the rock art, the bones in the shelters, the dry riverbeds visible from the air, curving across the sand like the memory of water. And the DNA, extracted from ancient bone in modern laboratories, telling a story that no one who lived it could have told. The story of where they came from, and where they went, and how they were connected to the vast human family that had been walking across this world for 300,000 years before any of them were born. You are lying in the dark right now, in a world built from the consequences of all of that walking. Every population movement, every mixing event, every convergence of peoples and landscapes that opened and closed over the deep cycles of the Earth's orbital rhythms, contributed to the distribution of people and genes and languages and ideas that eventually produced the specific circumstances of your existence. You are not separate from the people of the Green Sahara. You are downstream of them. Whatever movements they made, whatever mixings they participated in, whatever children they had in the shelters beside the ancient lakes, all of it eventually fed into the river of human history that flows toward the present. The woman with her arms around the two children at Gobero. She is not a stranger, she is an ancestor, in the broadest sense of that word. Not necessarily a direct biological ancestor. Most of the people who have ever lived are not the direct biological ancestors of any living person, but an ancestor in the sense of being part of the human story that produced the present. Her life, her choices, her love for whoever those children were, all of it is part of the fabric that the present is woven from. The desert is quiet tonight. The sand is cold in the way that desert sand is cold after dark, the heat of the day radiating back into the atmosphere with nothing to hold it, the temperature dropping fast in the thin, dry air. The stars above the Sahara are the same stars that were there when the lakes were there, when the cattle grazed in the green grasslands beside the water, when the children played in the shallows and the adults painted on the rock walls, and the world was entirely different from what it is now and entirely the same. The bones are in the ground. The DNA has been read. The story has been told in the dry and careful language of science, and then told again here in the dark for whoever needs to hear it tonight. The Sahara breathes, in and out, green and brown, open and closed. The cycle continues on timescales so long that human history is a brief, bright interval within them. We are in one of the brown intervals now, the dry phase, the desert phase. The phase when the bones are underground and the rivers are dust and the only water is what falls occasionally and briefly in the upland areas and drains away before anyone can follow it to the center. But the orbital mechanics that drive the cycle are still operating. The Earth is still tilting. The parameters are still shifting. And somewhere in the next several thousand years, the rains will come back to the Sahara. The lakes will fill. The grasslands will advance. The desert will green again. And whatever people are alive at that time will follow the water in, as people have always followed the water in, and make a life there, and leave their bones in the rock shelters, and paint on the walls, and love whoever they love, and be found, eventually, by whoever comes after. The cycle is very long. The bones are patient. The dark is very quiet. Sleep well. The bones of the people who stayed, who could not leave in time, or who chose not to, are the ones in the rock shelters. Their preservation is the accidental product of the same drying that killed the world they knew. The desert, in removing the moisture that would have accelerated the decomposition of organic material, also preserved what was already dead. The bones of the people who died as the Sahara was forming are among the best preserved ancient human remains in Africa, precisely because the environment that killed them also kept them. This is one of the quieter ironies of the archaeology of arid lands. The desert is a destroyer of life and a preserver of its material traces. The dryness that makes the Sahara inhospitable to the living also makes it a remarkable archive of the dead. The caves and rock shelters of the Sahara hold more than bones. They hold the remains of meals, the bones of animals eaten, the shells of freshwater mollusks gathered from the ancient lakes, the carbonized seeds of plants that no longer grow in the region. They hold the tools used to process those meals. Stone scrapers and knives and grinding stones worn smooth by the work of processing grain. They hold the ornaments, shell beads, bone pendants, ochre used for body paint or for decoration of objects. They hold the evidence of fire, hearths in specific locations used repeatedly over years, the ash layers building up in the sediment until they become visible features of the archaeological stratigraphy. All of this material, read carefully by the archaeologists who excavate it, builds a picture of daily life in the Green Sahara that is specific and detailed and deeply human, not abstract, not a demographic event or a genetic signature, a life. People waking up in the morning beside a lake, going about the business of feeding themselves and their families, processing hides and sharpening tools and watching the children play near the water, and burying their dead when they died, and painting on the walls when they needed to mark something, or remember something, or communicate something to whoever would come after. The rock art is the most direct of all the communications. It requires no specialist knowledge to understand what a painting of a hippopotamus in the middle of the Sahara is telling you. It is telling you that the water was there, that the world was different, that someone stood in front of a rock wall and made a mark that said, "This was real, this existed, I was here and I saw it." 3 things the bones give us that nothing else can. The first is presence. The bones are proof of specific human beings in specific places at specific times. Not populations in the abstract, not demographic trends or genetic signatures. Individuals. This person, of this approximate age and sex and health status, lived in this place at this time, ate these foods, suffered these injuries, and died here, and was buried here by whoever buried them. The bones make the people real in a way that no other category of evidence can. The second is time. The chemical changes that occur in bone after burial, the incorporation of carbon and oxygen isotopes from the burial environment, the decay of radioactive isotopes at known rates, allow the age of the bones to be measured with considerable precision. Radiocarbon dating of organic material from the Green Sahara sites gives us dates accurate to within a few centuries for most samples, and increasingly to within decades as the calibration curves improve. We know when these people lived, not approximately, specifically. The third is connection. The DNA in the bones connects the specific individuals whose remains were found to the broader web of human population history, to other populations in other places at other times, through the shared ancestry that the genome encodes. The bones of the woman at Gobero connect her to the populations of sub-Saharan Africa and the Levant and the Horn of Africa, and to every subsequent population that carries, in whatever diluted and distributed form, the ancestry of the people who lived in the Green Sahara. They connect her to us, in the broadest sense, as part of the human story that produced the present. Presence, time, connection. These are what the bones give us. And these are the things that make the story of the Green Sahara not simply an interesting chapter in the academic history of ancient African populations, but something that speaks directly to the question of what it means to be human in a world that keeps changing, because the world does keep changing. The Sahara has been desert and garden and desert again, cycling on its orbital rhythm, indifferent to the lives of the people who lived through each phase. The people adapted. They moved when they had to. They made what they could of the world they found themselves in. They loved whoever they loved and buried their dead with care and painted on the walls and followed the water, and eventually, when the water failed entirely, they followed the water out of the desert and carried their mixed and complicated genetic legacy into the populations of Africa and beyond. And the cycle did not stop with them. The orbital mechanics that drive the African humid period are still operating. The Earth is still tilting on its axis. The orbital parameters are still shifting in their 21,000-year cycle. And somewhere in the next several thousand years, not soon by any human timescale, but certain by the timescale of geology, the monsoons will shift northward again. The rains will come back to the Sahara. The lakes will begin to fill. The grasslands will advance from the south. The desert will green, and the bones in the rock shelters will still be there, covered by layers of new sediment deposited by the new rains, preserved in the darkness below the living world, waiting as they have waited for 5,000 years and more. Whatever people are alive when the next Green Sahara arrives will have no memory of the people who lived in the last one. 5,000 years of human history lie between us and the last of the Saharan pastoralists, and in 5,000 years, human cultures transform beyond recognition. The people of the next Green Sahara will not know about the woman at Gobero, or the rock paintings of the Tassili N'Ajjer, or the ancient DNA that told us where the Saharan people came from. They will be as separate from us in time as we are from them. but they will carry in their DNA the genetic legacy of every human movement that has occurred between now and then, including ours, including the specific combinations of ancestry that exist in the people alive tonight, in the cities and the villages and the open places of the world, each of them carrying in their cells the accumulated evidence of hundreds of thousands of years of human movement and mixing and survival. The chain does not break. It has not broken yet in 300,000 years of Homo sapiens existing in the world. It has been tested by ice ages and droughts, and the slow advance of deserts. It has been tested by disease and war, and the specific cruelties that humans have inflicted on each other across all of recorded history and far beyond. It has held, not because it is indestructible, because it has been held by people, each generation of people carrying it forward through whatever the world was doing around them to the next generation, who carried it forward again. The woman at Gobero was one link, one specific individual link, preserved in bone and DNA in the darkness below the Tenere Sand, found by accident by a paleontologist looking for dinosaurs, read by science that did not exist when she lived and was barely possible when she was found. She is found now. Her arms are still around the children. The dark is the same dark it has always been. The same dark that settled over the lakeshore where she was buried. The same dark that held the Sahara through the long centuries of its drying. The same dark that holds the rock shelters now, with their paintings and their bones, and the memory of water pressed into stone. You are in it. The same dark. The same human situation. Limited and temporary, and part of something vastly larger than any individual life. Lying in the warmth that others maintain, in the shelter that others built, breathing the air that has been breathed by every human being who has ever lived and who will ever live, carrying in your cells the genetic memory of movements so ancient they predate writing, predate agriculture, predate everything we call civilization, but not predate love. Love is older than the desert, older than the lakes, older than the paintings on the walls. The woman at Gobero had it before the desert returned. She held it in her arms and was covered by the sand with it and kept it there, intact, for 5,000 years. The Sahara did not take it. Nothing takes it. Let the dark hold you now. Let the long story of where you come from settle around you like the sand settles over bones. Slowly, gently, patiently. You are not outside the story. You are in it. You have always been in it. The desert breathes in and out, green and brown. The cycle continues, and the bones are patient. And the dark is very old, and it knows exactly what it is doing. Sleep well. There is one more thread worth pulling before the night settles fully in. The languages of the Sahara tell their own part of the story. Language leaves no direct physical trace. You cannot dig up a word the way you dig up a bone. You cannot extract ancient language from sediment the way you extract ancient DNA. But languages carry within their structure the record of the populations that spoke them. The divergences and convergences that linguistics can measure are, in many cases, shadows of the population movements that genetics and archaeology can track through other means. The Nilo-Saharan language family stretches today in a broad band across the Sahel from Mali in the west to Tanzania in the east, with isolated pockets scattered across the region. It is a language family that linguists have long had trouble classifying. Its internal diversity is extraordinary. The relationships between its constituent languages complex and contested. Some researchers have argued that the Nilo-Saharan family is not a genuine language family at all in the sense of sharing a single common ancestor, but rather a zone of languages that have been in contact for so long and mix so thoroughly that the apparent similarities between them are products of borrowing and convergence rather than shared descent. Whether or not that argument is correct, the geographic distribution of Nilo-Saharan languages is suggestive. It traces broadly the territories into which populations might plausibly have moved when they left the dying Sahara and headed south. The language map may be, in part, a population map, a record of where the Saharan people went when the water ran out, preserved in the sound patterns and the grammar structures of the languages their descendants speak today. The same logic applies to other language families in the region. The Chadic languages, spoken today in the Lake Chad Basin, the remnant of the ancient Lake Mega-Chad, include Hausa, one of the most widely spoken languages in Africa. The Chadic family belongs to the larger Afro-Asiatic phylum, which also includes Arabic and Hebrew, and the ancient languages of Egypt and Ethiopia. The distribution of Afro-Asiatic languages across North Africa and the Middle East and the Horn of Africa traces a pattern of population movement and spread that overlaps in interesting ways, with the pattern that ancient DNA is revealing for the same region and the same general time period. Language, genetics, and archaeology are telling the same story from different angles. They do not always agree in every detail. The relationship between language spread and population movement is complex, and the three types of evidence do not map perfectly onto each other. But the broad outlines converge. There were populations moving out of the Sahara as it dried. They went in multiple directions. They carried with them a mixed genetic and cultural heritage assembled during the African humid period. And the descendants of those movements are still there, in the populations and the languages and the DNA of the people who live in the territories the Saharan people entered. The Sahara itself is the archive. The bones are the documents. The DNA is the language the documents are written in. And the linguists and the geneticists and the archaeologists are, slowly and collaboratively, and with frequent disagreement, learning to read it. What they are reading tells us something that is important beyond the specific history of the African humid period. It tells us that human populations are not fixed, not bounded, not the contained, isolated, geographically determined groups that older models of human diversity assumed. They are mobile, mixing, connected across distances that seem impossible until you consider the time scales involved. A movement of 100 kilometers per generation is invisible in any individual human lifetime. Across 1,000 years, it covers a continent. The people of the Green Sahara moved into an apparently impossible landscape, the Sahara, and lived there for thousands of years. Then they moved out of it into landscapes that were already occupied and mixed with the people they found there. Their descendants did the same, and their descendants' descendants, generation after generation, each one moving a little, mixing a little, carrying the accumulated genetic legacy of all the previous movements into the territories of the future. You are the territory of the future, the living surface on which all of that movement has deposited its legacy. You carry in you, in the specific combination of genetic ancestry that makes you you, the evidence of every movement that contributed to the line that produced you, all the way back to the first humans, walking across Africa and eventually across the world, following the water, following the grass, following the particular human impulse that says the place on the other side of the horizon might be worth finding out about. The woman at Gobero followed the water to a lake in what is now the Tenere Desert. She lived there. She loved whoever she loved. She died and was buried with her arms around the children she held. And the sand covered her, and the desert settled in around her. And 5,000 years passed, and the wind found her, and the science read her. And now her story is part of the story that is being told in the dark to whoever is lying awake in the night, needing something to carry them towards sleep. She does not know she is part of your story. She could not have imagined you any more than you can fully imagine her. The gap is too wide. The time is too long. The world between then and now is too changed. But the bones are real. The DNA is real. The arms around the children are real. And the dark that holds you tonight is the same dark that held her, in the rock shelter by the ancient lake, 5,000 years ago, and a world away and not far at all. Sleep well. The stars above the Sahara tonight are the same stars that were above it when the lakes were full. The same constellations. The same slow rotation through the night sky that the people of the Green Sahara watch from the entrances of their rock shelters, reading the seasons in the rising and setting of specific stars, understanding their position in the year from the angle of the moon. The same stars that will be above the Sahara when the rains come again, and the next green period begins, and people who do not yet exist follow the water back into the desert and find, under their feet, the bones and the paintings and the dry riverbeds that will tell them what the desert used to be. Everything the Sahara was is still there, hidden, patient, waiting to be found or to be covered again, or simply to wait in the dark beneath the sand for whatever comes next. The bones of the woman and the children, the paintings on the rock walls, the ghost rivers legible from the air, the dry shells of the mollusks that lived in the ancient lakes, all of it still there. All of it still the Sahara, even in its current form, even buried under meters of sand and thousands of years of drying. The desert holds its dead, and the dark holds you, and the night is patient, and sleep is coming. Let it. The Sahara is quiet tonight. It is always quiet at night. The wind that scours it during the day drops after dark, and the desert becomes the most silent place on earth. No water, no insects, no animals close enough to hear. Just the cold and the dark and the faint creak of rock contracting as the temperature falls. The same silence that settled over the ancient lake shores when the last people left. The silence of a world between one state and the next. Between green and green. Between the water that was and the water that will come again. In that silence, the bones wait. They are not impatient. They have been waiting 5,000 years, and they can wait as long as it takes. Time means nothing to calcium phosphate in the dark below the sand, but it means something to you, and to the night, and to the story that has been traveling through the dark from those ancient lake shores to this moment. The story of the people who lived where they should not have been able to live, who carried genetic ancestry that should not have been there by the old maps, who loved and died and were covered by the advancing desert and found, eventually, by the science that could finally read what they had left behind. Found. Named as much as they can be named without their own words. Given back their complexity and their connections and their place in the vast human story. Not strangers, not objects, people. The night holds all of it. The bones and the paintings and the dry lakes and the ghost rivers and the DNA. And the arms around the children and the distance between then and now and the thread that runs from then to now without ever breaking. You are at the end of that thread tonight, the living end, the part that is still breathing and still warm and still awake enough to hear this. Let the thread hold you. The dark is very patient and very old, and it knows exactly what to do with the living things that come to it for rest. Sleep well,